story that I'm reading, well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I was turned on to Alaska Quarterly Review a long time ago when Grace Paley was publishing in your magazine. And I'm so grateful for her nonfiction that was published there and that very rarely saw the light of day other places. So we know her fiction, but we should all be reading her nonfiction too. This story is called Preparedness, and it takes place in 2002. Shortly after our invasion of Afghanistan. Did all newborns look like hillbillies? The baby's beady eyes and startling gums. It was like seeing a snake grin or glimpsing the gills of a fish in the mouth of a human. So unsettling. As was the fact that the baby never smiled at her, the most recent in a long line of people who hadn't found her funny. The first had been her parents. It was still an echo in her head, how one or the other would say, "Do you think that's funny?" in a way that made clear they did not. The baby lay on a dishcloth on the kitchen table while the dad finished wiping its creases. Its skin was loose, as though it had gone on a radical diet while still in her womb. She was born with size large skin and a size small body, the dad said with affection. But what the mother felt was closer to dismay. This little yellow baby, who even when naked, still seemed to be wearing some old man's wrinkled pants. "She's such a nice baby. It's too bad we're going to have to return her," she said, and her husband laughed, a short, startled bark. He found her funny. After only a few dates, he told her that even if he didn't laugh at the time, that later he often thought of things she said and laughed then. She hoped he was off laughing by himself a lot lately, since he sure wasn't doing it around her. A headline on top of the paper stacked beside the baby caught her eyes. 36 comedians killed in the war. She was aghast. "They're sending comedians now?" He looked at her neutrally. "Let me see that." She pointed out the story. Canadians. She was that kind of tired. The kind that bent words and emotions into unrecognizable forms. Her husband laid the baby on its cocktail napkin-sized diaper. He folded the tabs over, frowned, then pulled them open again and rotated the diaper under the baby. She was supposed to figure this out all by herself after he was gone. His National Guard unit had recently been activated. When they got the news, he'd insisted they move from the city to this safe, distant, barely affordable suburb. It might as well be the moon. None of her friends would venture this far from the city to visit. And the one time she descended into the metro system with the baby, she'd become nauseous. It felt wrong to take a baby underground, no matter how well lit. "Just remind me," she said, "what's so great about being in the Guard? Because I'm having a hard time remembering." In all fairness, the father had signed up long before he'd met her, back when the Guard was more of a national janitorial service, cleaning up after disasters and floods and things like that. But they'd always worn uniforms and carried guns. And wasn't that reason enough never to have volunteered? "The cross-section of people I've gotten to know. I'd never met them in my regular day-to-day life." "What do you think reality TV is for?" she said, and the baby startled, wailing. Volunteering was one thing. What she couldn't understand was why, now that there was a wife and a war and a baby, he hadn't unvolunteered. Why wouldn't he abandon his country when it was acting like a nutcase? Though that this trait was currently working in her favor had occurred to her. "You're going to sour your milk," her husband said, his voice straddling the line between exasperated and amused. "Don't mention milk," she cautioned, too late. Heat surged into her breasts. She looked down in disbelief as two dark circles expanded like time-lapse photos across the front of her cowboy shirt. She popped open the snaps and unhooked a soaked bra cup. He handed her the baby and she turned it to her breast. Its tongue fluted around her nipple, forming a mollusk-like seal as it nursed. He stood above her, his gaze lingering on her chest. "You liked my breasts. I didn't like your breasts. I loved them. I loved your breasts. This is too past tense for me. Just remember," he said to the nursing baby, I have a remainder interest. Her breasts were perfect, except that he couldn't touch them. At night, if she even heard his hand rasp across the sheets, her nipples began to weep milk. The nursing bra didn't help, even though essentially it was a peekaboo bra with cups that peeled down. But instead of having the louche allure of crotchless panties, it looked more like bandages from the Eastern Bloc. They'll be back, she said, but neither of them believed it. And in the meantime, we've got all this. She awkwardly proffered the breast the baby wasn't nursing on, a breast that very possibly outweighed the baby. Nice, he said, in a way she found momentarily cheering, then demoralizing. Nice? The baby reeled away from her, staring at the ceiling in a glazed, ecstatic state. The father slipped his hand under the little back and cupped the baby against his chest as she tucked and snapped herself back in. Do you love her? She asked. Sometimes. I guess I feel more like a technician than a dad. Like I should be wearing a lab coat and latex gloves when I handle her. He looked down at the baby. But I do feel something right here, he said, patting his lower stomach, when I look at her. He touched the baby's hand, and 3 tiny fingers wrapped around one of his. Huh, she said. She wasn't feeling it. She'd spent her adulthood thinking of love as something that required lingerie and elusiveness, not nursing bras and unvarying availability. Was this love? She leaned to blow warm air over the baby's fuzzy head, and it shut its eyes. I can tell from the way she looks at me that she doesn't like me, she said. All you are to her now is milk, and she likes that plenty. When she was inside me, we were closer. She remembered all the swirls and gurgles she'd interpreted as good humor. He said they should put a warning on all new babies. Your fear reflected here. Yeah, it should be woven into those blue stripes on swaddling blankets at the hospital, she agreed, her voice thickening. What a kindness that would be, he murmured, rubbing the index finger of his free hand across her forehead, trying to smooth it. Now I'm jumping ahead in the story. The husband's been deployed. As you might guess from the beginning of the story, she's not adjusting well. And the baby's about 7 months old now. An ache in her bones. She didn't know if it was grief or exhaustion or depression or leukemia. Maybe it was caused by reading the paper. She no longer cooked or cleaned. She fed the baby, ate energy bars, and read the paper. She read old newspapers and new ones compulsively, without pleasure or recall. She kept reading as the baby nursed, till they both dropped off. She didn't want to read about war, but it was strewn across the sheets. Today, when they woke up, it was even transferred to the baby's sweaty skin. She put the baby in the sink and washed her, gray-tinged water gurgling down the drain. Better go to the park. Her husband was in Afghanistan. She could brave the park. Park, she asked, and a shine immediately seemed to hit the baby. It turned to where the snuggling hung on the back of the door and said, bah. Yeah, she said, humbug, but we'll try it. As they walked down the hill to the park, she pointed out various signs. Stop sign, school bus, squirrel, McMansion. It was only as she caught sight of the playground and forced a wave at the clot of moms who truly seemed not to see her that her spirits plunged. Was it a reflection of the times, these tightened ranks of mothers? Did a new mom pose a security risk? She sat alone at one picnic table while the chattering moms clustered at the other. The baby writhed in the carrier, and she unfastened one side and slid her onto the edge of the table. The baby's impatient, intelligent eyes raked the trees, the dogs, the play structures before settling on the children. But she pulled the baby to her, but with a cry, it twisted back to the children. Oh, Bot, she said. She picked the baby up and carried her over to the sandbox, where 2 skinny blonde kids in dirty frocks glanced up at them. The baby kicked her fat legs and squealed. Both girls had the kind of fine hair that seemed to float rather than hang, The taller one said, "Do you remember when I was 3 and my hair was still curly? And I was yelling for mom to let me in and she said no. I wasn't born yet," said the smaller one. "Well, I don't think she heard me," said the taller girl. Then both girls looked up at her expectantly, as if she were going to provide some magic. "Why are you staring at us?" the younger one asked. "You have such interesting socks," she said, tilting the baby to see them. The smaller girl's socks were different colors and heights. "When my socks turn out like this, I pretend the tall one is the big sister and the short one is the little sister," the girl said, tugging up the shorter sock. "Oh, that's great," she said. She stood holding the baby, but then thought she might be making them uncomfortable. As she turned to leave, the big sister said, "Hey, do you want to play Pocahontas with us?" Warmth prickled up her arms and over her scalp. She glanced over at the moms. They were oblivious to her, and suddenly that seemed like a good thing. She felt she was probably committing some sort of generational faux pas, but she squatted on her heels anyway, the baby cooing up at the blondes. "How do you play?" "Well, I'm Pocahontas, and my sister is Captain John Smith. You could be the bad guy." It was so nice to be included. She felt the thrill of potential friends, even though there were maybe 6 and 4. "Can my baby play?" The older girl studied the baby dubiously, but the smaller one said, "Sure, he can be the bad guy's fat little dog." "Okay," she said, delighted, and the girls flashed quick smiles. "What do we do?" "You just act like the person you are," the big sister said, "like this." Turning to her sister, she trilled, "Captain John Smith, I just love your new tie-dyed dress." Captain John Smith grabbed the hem of her dappled skirt and sashayed along the edge of the sandbox. Her fat little dog squirmed in her lap, and she felt a wrench inside her chest. Just act like the person you are. Pocahontas bent over the baby, her wisps of hair tickling the baby's face, and the mother made little growls and yaps as she leaned her baby forward. A squeal pealed from the baby, and she craned her neck to look back at her mom, a gleaming bolt of eye contact, a fat chuckle, like this. Thank you.